Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Connect Conversations. Today's conversation is all about the requirements all good PMs must meet. It's brought to you as a part of MOBIUS Connect's ongoing YouTube series, Connect Conversations. I'm Kim Fuger, the manager of MOBIUS Connect, and I will be your moderator for the session. First, I'd like to take a moment to introduce the host of Connect Conversations series, Global Reliability Improvement experts, Doug Plucknette and Ron Moore. Okay, fantastic. Well, before I pass the microphone over to you guys, I want to encourage our audience here today to submit any questions that you have into the panel of your screen, and Doug and Ron will be more than happy to answer your questions throughout our time here today. Your questions will be answered on the air anonymously, so no need to feel like you're getting called out directly. Doug and Ron are here to provide their expert and perspectives from their years of experiences. And they're here to help you. All right, Ron and Doug, I'm going to pass this over to you.
When he was doing some research on B-24 bombers, okay, so this is 75 years ago, what he found was they would every, 50 or 60 flying hours, they would go in and do a major PM, overhaul, replace, and so on and so forth. And then shortly thereafter, the first 10 flying hours thereafter, they would have something on the order of 60 repairs, maintenance activities. And then the subsequent 10 hours, they would have 50 and 40 and 30 down till it got back to 10, at which point they would redo and start over and do the major maintenance activity. And they would see the same pattern. So, just want to let that soak for a minute. We've known now since for 75 years that doing intrusive time-based PM, if you will, is not a good thing. And in fact, if you look at the data, something on the order of 95%, even more of intrusive PMs are not necessary. Meaning you should be doing your PMs, mostly inspections and basic care type stuff. And you only do PM when intrusive PM, when it's warranted, when you have data to support that. Usually it's age or wear related and consistent. So that's one point. Second point, and I'll hand it back to Doug, is that there's a lot of studies out there that indicate somewhere between 10 and 30%, depending on the study you read, 10 to 30% of PMs are spot on. Now, do the math. That means something like 70 to 90% either need to be improved, maybe they're unnecessary, they're not quite right. So it's an area where there's tremendous opportunity for improvement. All right, Doug, over to you.
All right. Of course, you saw me looking down a couple of times. I had to check. I was quite sure that that's the plane that my uncle flew during World War II. And
yeah.
Sure enough, it was. So just one of those things when it comes up, I'm like, was it 20? Was it that number? Was it 24, 27? I couldn't remember. So I had to Google it, look it up. So getting back to PMs though, as Ron pointed out, they've been around a long time. And I think in terms of the U.S. history dates back to actually World War I, where they had troops get stranded in combat because their mobile equipment had broken down. And so as a learning experience between those two wars, they said, we're going to have, make sure we have some type of maintenance schedule for that mobile equipment so that we don't strand troops in the field and put them in harm's way. So it's pretty interesting. And of course, those folks, those veterans from World War I and World War II went into the manufacturing industry when they got back, and they applied some of those techniques and began to apply them to manufacturing equipment. And that's why today, You know, I say today, when I started in 1980, there was a ton of PMs, right? In fact, way too many. And that's where Ron comes up with this statistic that only 30% are spot on. Well, there's tons of them that are out there that have absolutely no impact at all, or are in fact intrusive and make things worse by doing them. One of them that I like to point out to groups, and of course, when you're apprentice, sometimes you do what you're told. I was lucky enough to come into the trades at a time where it was still okay to ask a question to a journeyman mechanic, and I can remember being told, "Hey, open the cover on that gearbox of this huge reactor." Of course, we had to pull some grating up, and it was outside, and get a chain fall up above it and loosen all these bolts and pull this cover off. And by that time, it was break time. You go down, you tell the boss at break, "Hey, the cover's off that." Not thinking that all the while in break, there's dust and dirt and crap blowing into that open gearbox, right? Which a journeyman mechanic would come up after break and take a look in there and go, "Oh, there you go. There's some gears in there, young man. They look good." Right? Put the cover back on. What did we learn? There was no measure being taken, right? Nothing being done in terms of backlash, nothing being done in terms of an oil sample. It was simply, yeah, the gears look good. And I guess what he looked for was there any broken teeth, right? Well, you could have told that by not even taking the cover off. And of course, this was before vibration analysis was being used at our plant. But just the same, to leave it open and have all that dust and dirt blown into that perfectly good oil, that wasn't what I'd call a best practice. So we had tons of those types of things that we needed to go through to say, what's the right things to do PM on? And I'll pass it back to you.
Well, you know, one of the things, and this is really kind of in your wheelhouse because you're more of an expert than I am, but, you know, one of the things we need to do, and maybe not literally do a so-called RCM analysis, but we need to think about, you know, what are the failure modes? You know, what are the consequences of the failure mode and so on, you know, applying RCM principles to determine whether or not we even ought to be doing a PM. So, and looking at some of the data, you know, most equipment that I've seen at least has a random failure pattern. Well, doing time-based replacement is not going to do you any good. You know, in fact, it'll make things worse because you'll do work unnecessarily, and then you'll restart the infant mortality risk, which is really quite high. So I think it's really important to ask yourself, well, what are the failure modes and what are the consequences of that? And then put PMs in place that either prevent or detect that failure mode, or if the consequence of failure is negligible, then run to fail is okay. And that's kind of a, you know, the hillbillies version of RCM. So I'll just bounce it back to you, Doug. You're the expert in this.
Yeah. When it comes to PM, I always tell people this is the time to really learn about the 6 conditional probability of failure distributions that Stan Nolan and Howard Heap put in their report. And it's been, you know, this is data that show those curves several different ways. And that's where Ron came up with a percentage of as the highest percentage of failure modes are random. 68% being infant mortality, 14% being random, 7% being best new type failures. But altogether, you're looking at 89% of the failure modes are random in nature. That leaves you 11% that are, according to Nolan and Heap's data, that are candidates for PM. Now, I redid that study in 2003, and those percentages were a little bit different. It was even less items that were wear-based. So you're looking at somewhere, I tell people, somewhere between 7 and 10%, right? Depending on how well your plant has gone in terms of upgrading to electronics, getting rid of things like limit switches and push buttons, and putting in solid state electronics that are not wear based. So some of those older items were things that you could look at and say, how many actuations were they good for before you replace them? Most of the solid state stuff is just totally random in nature, and man, this stuff lasts. I hate the word forever when it comes to equipment, but man, it lasts a long, long time. So it comes down to look for things that are subject to corrosion, erosion, abrasion, and that's a good start in terms of what should we be doing PM on.
Yeah, just me throw in one more comment there. And this is a comment from the Navy nuclear fleet. And that's this: even when you have those kinds of, wear related or time related, failure modes, if you have high variation in your practices, high variation in material, high variation in startup and shutdown, high variation in, the craftsmanship you use to do those PMs, you're going to introduce a whole lot of variation, which means that 7 to 10% number is probably going to be a lot less, maybe down pushing zero if you have a lot of variation. So I just wanted to throw that in there. Even when you have a wear-related failure mode and you have high variation, you're still going to get a random failure pattern. So back to you, Doug.
Yeah. So, well, RCM is a great way to deal with this. It's also it's a method that takes a lot of leadership and discipline and structure. And I always tell people, look, if we're starting to look at your PM program, PM optimization is also a great tool. It's not as nearly as effective as RCM, but it's going to give you a great start on right sizing your PM program. Looking at things, looking at your PMs for, are they measurable? That should be your number one criteria. If a PM isn't measurable, then I say, all right, you've got one of the things there that I like to see. It doesn't mean it necessarily is a bad PM, but let's talk about, all right, if it's not measurable, which is quantitative, then we want to look at qualitative. What can I do with this PM or this piece of equipment that makes it, if it's not measurable, it gets done the same way? I like to use two examples for those. Number one, starting with the car, you could measure your tread depth on the tires, right? And using that measure, you could come up with, in fact, some states that require inspections of tires will give you a measure of what's acceptable, what's unacceptable. That's a go, no-go range. When you get to the no-go, it's time to replace the tire. All right, so that's measurable piece. That's your quantitative. They also, now that manufacturers of tires make those wear bars that go in between the treads, and you can look at those. And pretty much anybody can look at it and say, is the tread worn to the point where the wear bar is being touched? That's qualitative PM. All right. Other examples that I used for electrical cabinets. It's a good idea to safely inspect the electrical cabinet. Make sure that you don't have any arcing and tracking going on by using airborne ultrasound. Open the cabinet, take a video if you don't have one of those windows, take an IR picture of it, see if you got any hot spots. The other thing is to do, it looks like, make sure there's no dust or debris. So power down, vacuum out with that dust and debris with a vacuum brush, and then inspect the door gasket, right? And that door gasket should be soft and pliable. It should not be hard. It should not be cracked. If it's hard and it's cracked, then you put into it, replace the door gasket. So very clearly written, right? That if I do it and Ron does it, we come up with the exact same result, right? And that's the important piece of a well-written, good PM. So looking for those two criteria, qualitative, quantitative, and we also look at the wear base. corrosion, erosion, abrasion. Those are important things to be looking for when it comes to PMs.
Yeah, just to add to that, and the phrase I use is the PM should have specificity that allows you to determine if a defect is present or absent. And if it doesn't have that specificity, you don't have a PM, you've got a hope. You know, you hope the guy doing it will know enough to do what needs to be done. And that hope is very often misplaced unless you have, you know, specificity, you know, qualitative, quantitative, you know, measures and pictures and whatever, you know. Another one just qualitative might be is the on a motor is the housing for the fan. Is it clear or is it gummed up with crap?
And pictures are a great one, by the way. You know, I've been writing some PMs actually for a company this past year, and we're looking at chains and sprockets. Well, the chain one is easy. There's stretch standards for all different size chain, and you can put in the PM, all right, here's how you measure it. You count the number of links, you measure the stretch between those from a new chain to the chain that's in use, and there's a go, no-go measure for that, correct? How do you know when to change the sprocket, right? Oh, I always tell people, when you start to see hooking in the teeth, what does that mean? So that's where the picture comes in, right? Get a good picture of what a hook sprocket looks like, or when it's starting to hook, right? When it's starting to wear. I've also seen companies that they'll say, well, just as it gets to that point, we turn it around, we flip it over, and we'll use the other side of that sprocket. Well, that's good too, but understand it's not going to last as long. The second half isn't going to last as long as the first half. But pictures are a great thing.
There's a company out there, Idcon. I'll put in a plug for them. I don't get a nickel for saying this, but they sell PMs that are fairly specific. It's idcon.com. I think they'll sell you 100 for 10 grand or something like that. That was the price a few years ago. May have gone up or whatever, but you just, I mean, it's really important that you be specific on, you know, what your PM, what you expect out of it. You know, PMs that say check chain, check motor, check belts, check whatever, they're not particularly good. And you're really depending on the work ethic, the skill, the amount of time available for the guy to do it, unless you put particulars in there that tell you when a defect is present or absent. Another thing I wanted to bring up, Doug, I don't know if we're finished with that particular line of logic, but the OEMs, they're going to give you PMs, right? Their recommendations. Now, a colleague of mine out in Australia, Steve Turner, he's done a bunch of studies, but I know one in particular he sent me, and he said this one is characteristic of the rest. Something on the order of maybe 30, maybe 40% of OEM PM recommendations are spot on. Okay, everybody can do the math. It means the rest of them are crap, and not crap per se. It's that there's a problem here. There are two big problems that I see, and Doug, you may see others, and they're not unethical, but they do have a bias for selling you more stuff.
There you
so
go.
They're going to over recommend stuff just to help you buy insurance. Well, if that's an intrusive PM, you're not buying insurance, you're buying problems, because you're going to do stuff more often than you need to, and you're going to restart the risk of infant mortality failures. So that's one problem. The other problem is they very often don't understand your operating context. So what's the environment it's in? How do you operate this thing? And if you've got a pump that you turn on once a year for some particular service, that's going to have a very different set of failure modes than if you've got one that you run continuously, or if you've got one that's in hot standby versus cold. It really depends on the operating context and the environment you're operating in, whether or not those PMs apply in light of, their bias towards selling you more. So I'll bounce it back to you, Doug.
I'm disappointed that I haven't thought to sell my PMs.
Well, maybe you should. I'll recommend you too.
All right. So the next piece of this, when I think about PMs, is folks will say, how often? How often should I do this PM, Doug? All right. And I'd say to them, all right, this is where it really gets tricky, because there are some, there are lots of things. If you look this up on Google, you're going to find page after page after page of people's ideas of how often you want to do PM. And a lot of them are statistical based. They look at Weibull distributions and things like that. No one heap came down. They said the PM should be done based on the useful life of the component, and it should be completed prior to a rapid increase in conditional probability of failure. What in the world does that mean? Right? So I tell people, you're going to have to start taking a wag at it, right? I wish I knew, like people would say, so you don't have standard times on these? I said, yeah, when it comes to a belt and shivs, chains and sprockets, yeah, sure. Right. Provided you align them correctly and tension them properly, yeah, we can come up with a time frame to say how often you ought to do that. But realistically, it's based on knowledge and experience of the people that work in your place, because it gets down to what Ron talked about. What is the operating context and the environment in which your plant operates? It makes a big difference.
Yeah. Back to a broader point that we mentioned earlier, most failures occur randomly. And so you really need to do proper condition monitoring based on the equipment, its failure modes, and their consequences.
Yeah.
So if you can just keep that in mind and look at that every time you're trying to decide, you're going to do a much better job. And condition monitoring, that doesn't mean just vibration, oil, infrared, and all that neat technology. That's wonderful stuff. But it also, and I think as importantly, means the operator looking at process condition, equipment condition. Are we seeing any deterioration in the performance of the process? And if so, wonder why that's happening. And if so, what's the consequence of that? And if so, what do we need to do? So I think that's, of paramount importance that you do that, which means, by the way, bringing up another element of all this is, what about operators doing some of these inspections and checks and, minor adjustments and all that sort of thing? I think that's an essential part of any good so-called PM program is operator basic care. So, Doug, any comments on any of that? That was kind of a mouthful.
Yeah, first going back to intervals, I want to close a couple things out on that. In determining whether or not you've got a good PM. Number one is, what's the cost of doing the PM versus the cost of replacing the item? That would seem to be kind of a common sense type thing, but you'd be surprised how often. And when I'm talking about cost of doing it, that's the cost of the downtime of the asset. So if we're doing intrusive maintenance, we got to shut it down. So we're not making product. If we're not making product, what's it costing us? Is it worth doing that PM based on the loss, right? And then have we chosen the correct materials? Sometimes when we see things failing at a high rate, we don't have the correct material. When we're talking about corrosion, erosion, abrasion, let's measure those wear rates and your PM should be based on that wear rate, right? We shouldn't have to continue to measure it month after month after month. If we do it 2-3 times and we find out it takes consistently somewhere between 5 and 7 months for this thing to wear out, we're going to do our PM at 5 months and we're going to replace it at that point in time, right? So yeah, the last thing that you're going to see the statistical tools for determining PM intervals, and until one is absolutely clear in regards to the above questions, my advice to companies is to take a conservative guess to begin with and adjust intervals based on your data, right? Again, your operating context makes a huge difference here. So moving into operator PMs, lots of places have special names for this now. They call it TPM or operator care or whatever it is you're calling it. If we have the equipment operators doing specific things on a shift by shift or day by day basis, those are PMs, right? And they really should be documented, and they should be done in a way that, again, they're consistent. That's the key to all good PMs, is the consistency of them. That, again, if I do it and Ron does it, we come up with the same conclusion and do the same thing. So this needs to be true with your operator care task or your operator PMs. It needs to be consistent from one shift to the next, right? So written very clearly, make sure you train your people, all right? What would be some good examples of operator PMs, Ron?
Well, just like I said earlier, listening to the process and the equipment and looking to see if there's any deterioration. And you might, have I got a temperature rising? Have I got a acidity decreasing or increasing? Have I got precipitation rates that aren't quite what they ought to be? I'm talking about chemical plants. Or in a steel plant, am I starting to see the crown of the slab, go a little bit south, so I know the roll needs to be replaced? Am I seeing, oil leaks? It's the tighten, lubricate, clean stuff, having a look at, say, maybe some filters here and there. It will depend on the equipment and its failure modes and the role of the operator for the equipment. But the analogy I use is my car. My car is an 88 Jeep Cherokee. It's got 312,000 miles on it. And it's same engine, same transmission. The only thing I've replaced are tires and batteries and whatnot, But I check the mileage every time I fill it up to see if there's any deterioration. I check to see if it's burning oil between filter changes. I check, I just have a look and listen and feel. If I'm feeling a shimmy in the steering wheel, I know I've got an unbalance in the tires. It's that sort of thing. And a lot of that stuff, just talk to the operator. Ask him or her, well, how do you know something's going wrong here? And quantify that and, standardize it. So I don't know if I've answered your question or not, Doug.
Those are all some good examples. Another key to this with those operator PMs is, if you've got them out there doing them and you have it consistent, when they come to you and say something doesn't sound right, or I've spotted this or that here, you have to respond, right? There has to be some type of response from the maintenance group, right? Or from their supervisor, if that's their first line of report. Go out, take a look and see what's going on. Ask questions so that you understand what they're showing you and why that's a concern, right? And that's the thing of teaching the operators, when you say, hey, go out, look for oil leaks, because if you see a leak ends up, over time, we could lose a bit of oil, the gearbox is going to get hot, and you teach them there's a chain of events that goes on here, and if we don't follow through with that, we're going to end up burning that gearbox up. We're going to have to replace it. They need to understand the consequence of not doing it, right? Sometimes. This is also one of those things that technology is a great thing. It's also is kind of has the other edge of that sword that is sometimes not so great, right? I want my operators out there looking in the field at pressures, temperatures, flows, timing, things like that. The level of a gearbox in terms of the oil, right? Those things, those visual things, to teach them the important aspects of what does good look like, right? And what's the problem if it doesn't look that way? What could be happening? So, and I have endless examples of these. One is, an operator that I used to work with that was real good about saying, "Hey, we got a coupling that's about to be shot," right? And in his rounds, he would, look in through the guard with his flashlight, and he could see those Lovejoy couplings, the rubber spider on them starting to shed little pieces of rubber. When that starts to happen, it's become hardened or embrittled, and they don't last too much longer after that. He was really good about understanding that it wasn't something you'd hear; it's something you got to go out and look for, right? And then reporting that. We had several every year. When you're talking dozens of pumps that we were able to replace before they failed, and you don't want it failing in the middle of a batch or middle of a run where it's going to cost you a bunch of money.
Yeah.
So
one exercise, let me just throw this out there that you guys may want to do, but it's an exercise I've done several times now. But you sit down with a couple of senior operators, a couple of senior maintenance technicians, maybe an engineer, and you got to say a big problem with, say, a line or a machine or a production area. Okay, everybody says this is a mess. We got to do something about this. Blah blah blah. And so sit down with them and say, okay, what are some of the things happening out there that cause us to lose production or cause us to incur extraordinary costs? And then you kind of prioritize those. And that gives you, some prioritized set of actions you might want to take. But the next thing I've done before we even start putting together teams and addressing all the, the issues is, hey, why don't we go have a look at this thing? I mean, let's go clean it. Okay. Because when you clean it, what happens? You find stuff. Okay. So just one example, we did one of these on a packaging line, and we found the tear weight hadn't been calibrated in, weeks or months. The glue pop was set, 10 degrees too high. The chains were loose. There was grease accumulating all over everything. The what do you call it? The little reflectors for the visual, indicators were offset. The belt wasn't tracking right. I mean, it was, and they had cardboard and little inserts of cardboard to offset some adjustments they were supposed to make on the final, the final pack. Cardboard, for crying out loud. Anyways, just go out and clean it. And as you're cleaning it, think about all the defects you've discussed in your analysis. And every time I do one of these, we find dozens and sometimes, hundreds of little defects, the sum of which are just making things awful. So try that. If you got a machine or an area that's got a problem, clean the damn thing and find all the defects and correct them, and you'll be a lot happier at the end of it. And then, really important part here, and then set some standards in place for operating and maintaining, some PMs in place for keeping it that way. So, okay, I'll get off my high horse there.
All right.
Your turn.
So The last thing in terms of PMs that would knock a PM off my list would be one that can be replaced by an on-condition task, right? And we get into this often. I hear it with those things that I've been talking about: belts, chains, shivs, sprockets. That we can pick that up with vibration analysis and detect it before the failure occurs. And I'm perfectly fine with doing that, with eliminating the intrusive PM. However, I'm also a person that deals in reality, and I say I'm all for you doing that, provided you can prove to me that your company is good at responding to those on condition tasks. That when your technician comes to the boss and says, "Hey, I did vibration analysis on this fan, and I could see that the belts are stretched or slapping based on this frequency that I got here, and we need to shut this down and replace those belts." If that actually happens, I'm good with going that way. If you're an old school company and they're not buying into that yet, stick with that PM schedule, and every 6 months or so, shut that thing down, pull the guard on it, check the tension on those belts, inspect them for cracking, and inspect them for where they're riding in the shiv to make sure that the shiv isn't worn. Use a shiv gauge to measure that shiv. Look for any fraying. And if you have to replace them, make sure you replace them in a match set. That makes a big difference on how long they'll last as well. So yeah, PMs can be effective. It's just one of those things that there's a series of things that have to be met, right? It has to be wear-based, right? It have to have a consistent wear rate, all right? So, or consistent useful life, so to speak.
Yep. I want to, touch on an example and then touch on the PF interval. We'll talk about that. We want to talk about that for a minute. An example of, and these are two kind of disparate subjects. I mean, all related to, maintenance, but suppose you've got a PM that says, check calibration on gauge weekly for the next 52 weeks, and during that time period you've checked it every week and it's in calibration except for maybe one time. So what would that suggest? Well, it'd probably suggest to you doing it too often.
Yep.
All right, but I forgot to tell you that this gauge, this instrument, maintains the neutron flux on a nuclear reactor. So now how you feel about that shortening the interval? So the point being, you have to think about consequence of failure, right, when you're considering the interval for these PMs. So I just wanted to make that point. You may want to do something far more often than you otherwise would if the consequence of failure is, catastrophic, like letting a reactor go, go nuclear, for lack of a better word.
Right. So that actually gets into one of the more confusing aspects of RCM, which are hidden functions and hidden failures, right? And people will confuse them for PMs as well, because they are time-based. Checking an e-stop, for example, on a machine, or a light curtain, or a door switch, right?
Yeah.
People will say, geez, you've got that down for once a week. Well, what's the potential consequence of the e-stop not working? Right? If it means that somebody could get caught in the machine and lose a finger or a hand or something worse, right, then that may drive you to say we ought to check it once a week, even though we haven't had an e-stop fail here in 10 years. Yeah. Right? And I tell them, look, again, we could go in and we could do what they call a FIFI calculation. If that's going to make your heart feel better, right, All I'm going to tell you is if that calculation, if you were doing that task once a week and that calculation told you you only needed to do it every 6 months, if at some point in time something bad were to happen and the e-stop didn't work and somebody lost a piece of a hand or an arm, there's an organization called OSHA that's going to come to your plant and say, why did you change the interval?
Yeah, and there's a bunch of lawyers waiting to have you for supper,
Right?
And it won't
So-
know, and you're the meal.
I also tell companies, look, you should document those things. Those are failure finding tasks. And we didn't put that as a subject for, I'm just going to add this into the PM because they are time based. That's how they get put into a CMMS. They get put in exactly like a PM. So I'm going to cover them. All right. And so I say, make sure that these are documented, right? That when somebody does the tasks, they actually sign off that it got done and what the result was. So if you have your operators doing it, somebody still has to go into that CMMS and say, operator Fred did it on this week and his outcome was this, right? I would prefer that you, again, leave these to an electrician, but realistically, I know how plants work and how short-staffed people are. If you're going to have an operator do it, just make sure it gets documented who did it on what date and what the result was. So those failure finding tasks, again, it's just like Ron talked about. It depends on what the consequence is and how, in terms of what are you comfortable with in terms of rate for checking or not checking them. When I do RCM at plants, I find in every RCM analysis, there's probably, if we're talking 100 components, we'll have maybe a dozen failure finding tasks. And of those dozen, typically around 40% of them are new. There's stuff that they hadn't thought about doing and had not been doing in the past. So there's a lot of those out there, and they're important to understand.
Yeah, one other thing I want to throw in there, Doug, is that, on failure finding, and just one example, there may be others that I'm not familiar with, is, for example, on diesel generators, your emergency backup power.
Yeah.
There's frequently, once a month you go and start it up and shut it down just to make sure it runs.
Yeah.
Well, you have to be real careful with some of those because starting up and shutting down that often may induce some defects that you need to be aware of, that you need to minimize the risk of that happening.
Yeah.
So that's just another comment. And wanted to touch on the PF interval and give you a couple examples, and then we got 2 or 3 other little things we want to touch on here. But the PF interval is kind of like a piece of string. How long is it? Oh, maybe for a transformer, it might be, 6 months. Maybe for a pump, it might be, a week or even a day. So the PF interval is something you have to apply some judgment based on your experience in dealing with that machine and its operating context. And related to that, what if the PF interval is really short? That is, you don't really get any warning. And the example I use here is, again, with my car, the PF interval for headlights is about 0.
Yeah.
But you got 2, so you're probably okay to run to failure.
Yeah.
Rather than replace. What's the PF interval, let's say, for your timing belt? Well, it's, probably down near 0 for most vehicles. So what do you do there? Well, you don't run to failure, right? Because that could be really expensive for you. So you replace it on a very conservative time basis. Your timing belt, you could probably get, 300,000 miles out of it. Go ahead and try that and see what happens. So you're probably replacing a lot more often than you otherwise would if you could detect when it is, deteriorating. And the last one might be, this is in a plant, your PLCs. Well, what's your warning? Well, not much, but if it's really critical that PLC be functioning, otherwise consequence of failure is huge, then you might put in inline spares. And they both got a little green light, And when one of them fails, it turns red and you go find a replacement. So it really depends on the consequence of failure when you have a very short PF interval as to what strategy you apply. So any comments on that, Doug?
All I'm going to say is every time you think something should be simple,
It's not.
it's not. Right.
Yeah.
I've done RCM on thousands of pieces of equipment and walked in some places and thought, this one's going to be a piece of cake, only to find out, well, let's see, we can do on condition maintenance on this, and they got a standby, so we'll do a failure finding task on that, start it up, and then they tell you, no, we can't really do that. Why not? Well, if you start that up, the stuff that we pump, it basically turns to like concrete within a couple days. So if you run some of that through the standby pump, unless you got a way to clean all that out, that standby pump becomes useless. And while that's happening, the primary's kicking up too. So standby only works when the primary is totally failed, and you just go, okay. So, it would be nice if all things were equal, right? And things were similar, we'd say, all right, run that standby for a while. And while we got it running, let's do vibration analysis on it. Let's do a bunch of different technologies on it, make sure it's in good health. Then we'll switch back over to the primary and we're good to go. And now we know what the health of both of our pumps are. It's not always that simple, right?
Yeah. One thing we hadn't touched on is the criticality of people having the skills, the training, the skills, and having some sort of development program so that you bring them along. I don't know if it was you, Doug, or if somebody out there indicated that in operations that have eliminated their apprenticeship programs, you're 5 times more likely to induce defects, particularly on startup, than you are during normal operation, which really, is very telling. If you don't have a good training, development, upskilling of folks that's fairly rigorous, fairly disciplined, you have objective standards to know when somebody's qualified to do something. So, and that's really, I think, sorely lacking in a lot of the operations I've been in. They learn things by tribal knowledge. Yeah. Well, sometimes that works really well, and sometimes it's not worth a flip. So it's really important that you have some sort of development program, an upskilling program for your people, and when they have the skills and that they are effectively applying them, because you've got the procedures and standards, the checklists, and all that sort of thing. And my background says, the military does a pretty good job of that.
Yep. Because
they have that in place. And industry, some places, yep. Some places, not so much.
Most places, no.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Just one other comment, Doug. I always like to throw this out there when I've got an audience, and we got a small one here. And that's this. If you think education is expensive, try ignorance.
Yeah. So
that's really expensive.
I went through some of that in the last year myself, and we added a room onto the house, a bathroom, and it was a covered porch area, so it had a foundation underneath it. But I thought, I got this, which it did have most of it. But when it came down to the finer carpentry skills, there was a few struggles. Let's just put it that way. Some wasted material. And, I've talked a lot about my dad through the years. He retired as a skilled tradesperson and a supervisor from Kodak. He was lucky enough to retire when he was 51. And since that time, he's built himself a nice wood shop in the basement. He's really a master carpenter. I mean, he builds, whole chests and pieces of furniture with dovetail joints. And I mean, the stuff just comes out beautiful, right? So my nightmare is anything project like that I got going is I know he's going to come take a look at it, right? But there's also, I've learned He's only a mile away. Hey, Pops, come on over here and take a look at something. How would you do this? Right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And let's just say wood isn't nearly as expensive as the materials we use in the manufacturing company. So if you think your people are saving, you think you're saving yourself some money by not having an apprentice program, think again. Because I can tell you, for all those little mistakes that I made with when you don't have somebody to talk to, holy smokes, they add up and it costs you big money.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. So we hadn't talked yet about measures for our PMs, percent completion. Doug, you want to touch on that for a minute?
Oh, yeah. I mean, a good PM program, this is the thing. I always tell people, and this comes out, it's funny, I'm reading a book and I'm struggling to remember the name because I have it downstairs and it's not right in front of me. But it's really about understanding your measures and setting goals. And this person says most people try to set goals that are way too realistic, right? So in his discussion of PM, he says it should be 100% and nothing less, right? And if you can't accomplish that, you're doing your business a disservice. So, but realistically, it's percent completion, right? So what's out there and what have you completed, right? I would add to that, and this becomes more subjective in terms of the PMs. Did the tradesperson indicate that the PM actually saved a failure? Right. And if we're doing them at the right interval, that should be pretty evident that you're seeing wear and we caught it before we had some failure occur. Right. Especially when we get into, again, belts, chains, shivs, sprockets, wear plates, gears, all those types of things are measurable. Right. And if we're doing our PMs at the right interval, it's pretty evident when you go in there and you do that intrusive PM that man, this thing was on its way out. Right.
Yeah. Yeah. One comment I wanted to make before we, come down to a close. I'm gonna have to leave a tiny bit early today. I've got to get my handicapped daughter over to an appointment. But anyways, once a year or so, now you ought to be doing this on a continuous basis, really reviewing your PM program. Yeah. Every time you get feedback, make an adjustment, put it in your CMMS and so on and so forth. But, I think once a year, do you well to sit down and go through your PM program and do a kind of a strategic review or an annual review, call it what you will, but just to say, is this working or not?
Yeah. By the
way, what's not working, what are we going to do about the things that aren't working so well?
There's two other things that I thought of that are really part of a good PM. And number one is what failure modes are you looking to prevent through the PM? And then what are the consequences of not doing it? That should be written clearly in every PM that's out there, right? So that people understand, hey, if we skip this is what the consequences are.
Yeah.
All right. Here's what we're taking. Here's the risk that we're taking by not doing it.
Yep. So that's, I think that's appropriate and good advice. We got a couple of minutes. I wanted to throw out a plug for, you mentioned, 100% is your target.
Yeah.
Not 60, not 70, but the point of that is, that's your target, but you want to use the gap to analyze why did we not achieve that?
Yeah.
What do we need to do to improve that?
Yep.
So the focus is on closing the gap, not necessarily, you may never get to 100%. Okay, fine, but that still ought to be your target. And what are you going to do to close that gap? One thing you ought to be doing is proactive things that delay the failure mode from, occurring. And that comes about through craftsmanship and precision and proper operation, but the other ought to be, what can we do? Close that gap and move us closer to 100%. And the same thing applies to, when you schedule your maintenance. I'll throw this in again. when you schedule your maintenance, you should schedule 100% of the workforce available.
Yep.
But allow for breaks to the schedule. Now, if you do that, you'll get more work done, and then you can go analyze the breaks and see what's causing you to, to miss your target, and, and you'll do a better job. So.
Very good.
All right, I'm done. I got to run, guys.
All right, great.
Appreciate
Grandpa.
you being here. We didn't have any questions.
No questions.
We're not that good, Doug.
I did see my friend Bill Bartow check in here at the last minute.
Hey, Doug, how are you?
Good. How are you?
Good, bud.
So,
good to see you.
All right, guys, I'm going to leave. I'll leave you, Doug, and Kim, to handle any comments or questions. So. It's been a pleasure. We'll see you in a couple of weeks.
All right.
All right.
Yes.
I should be a grandpa again by then.
Okay, wonderful.
All right.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
I'm excited for that. All right. Well, thank you both for another great conversation. And again, this was an awesome presentation. We thank you for your time. Just anybody who's still listening, you are welcome to still submit any questions. I will make sure to get those over to Ron and Doug to answer kind of off air for you. But just as a quick reminder, you can see past episodes of Connect Conversations on YouTube, and we will share the link to subscribe to our YouTube channel in a follow-up email after this webinar. Be on the look in the next 2 weeks. On the 18th, Doug and Ron will be speaking about dealing with poor performers. So head on over to Reliability Connect to register for that, and we will send you out the link. And if you're interested in engaging with other industry professionals or would like to participate on the industry's live feed and forums on MOBIUS Connect, you can visit MOBIUSConnect.com to create your free profile. And be sure to follow us on social media at MOBIUS Connect to stay up to date with the latest community happenings. If you have any questions at all, you can email our MOBIUS Connect team at info@mobiusconnect.com. Thanks again for joining us. Have a great day. Please stay safe, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.